Stone Cold Prose, building better words.
J.K. Rowling used to be everybody's darling. She was a rags to riches story, a broke single mom who created one of the most beloved franchises in history and achieved worldwide fame and almost unimaginable wealth. So how did the most popular author of the 21st century, the creator of Harry Potter, fall from grace? The answer lies within another beloved intellectual property, Frankenstein. Hi guys, welcome back to Stone Cold Prose, where we build better words, better thoughts, and better men. I'm Miles Watson, novelist and author of numerous award-winning series, including Cage Life, Sinner's Cross, and The Chronicles of Magnus, among others. I worked in Hollywood for 12 years, law enforcement for another 10, and now I break it all down and build it back better. So let's get into this. J.K. Rowling is not an easy woman to cancel. After all, the Harry Potter series sold over 500 million copies. The films made from those books grossed $7.7 billion. The authorized merchandise has sold $15 billion. Her own personal worth is quoted at £820 million, making her, by American standards, a billionaire. And she certainly could be a billionaire, even in British pounds, if she didn't give so much money to charity. Perhaps most importantly, she retains enormous legions of devoted fans, people who grew up with her works. People to whom the Harry Potter universe is as important as Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, or any other fictive universe in which it's possible to immerse yourself completely and forget real life even exists. It's nevertheless true that Rowling's public image has been tarnished, deliberately and willfully, and her reputation in certain quarters diminished or destroyed as a consequence of this. The once adoring, even sniveling way the media deals with her has given way to a barely concealed hostility. She's often identified in the first few lines of any article as a bigot, a trans-exclusionary radical feminist, someone who's against trans rights, someone who betrayed her own feminism and alienated her adoring fans by revealing these hidden prejudices. Few journalists writing about Rowling nowadays even bother with the pretense of objectivity. You'd think her a polarizing political figure rather than one of the most influential writers of the modern era who's also given enormous sums of money to charitable causes and champion the cause of feminism. A few years ago, all this would have been unthinkable. Rowling hit almost every note possible in the improbable success scale. In her work, it has actual cultural resonance. When I describe my graduate school as looking like Hogwarts, I don't need to explain myself any further. The image comes ready-made to your mind, even though you might never have seen the movies or read the books. Likewise, when I say someone looks like Harry Potter or has all the charm of Lord Voldemort, no one is going to scratch their heads at the obscurity of the reference and say, what the hell does that mean? Like Stephen King before her, Rowling's contributions to our vernacular are permanent. The tarnishment, some might say vandalism, of Rowling's public image began with her sarcastic reply to an op-ed piece, which referred to women as people who menstruate. In this day and age, when vocabulary at large is being bent and beaten into these vaguely Orwellian shapes to soothe the easily ruffled feathers of a certain section of our political demographic, the idea that women, as a word, should yield to people who menstruate is not really a surprising one. Nevertheless, there are many who object to this sort of nonsense, and Rowling is one of them. The reply she wrote on Twitter, "I'm sure there used to be a word for those people, women. Someone help me out. Wumben, wimpund, wumud," caused an immediate online furor. And when Rowling clarified her position later on, explaining that she supported trans people, but that sex was real, it only added fuel to this bizarre fire. The reaction among the Hollywood crowd, amateur activists, and the intellectual left was immediate and violent in terms of its rhetoric. A number of Harry Potter cast members, people who owed their entire livelihoods to her existence, turned on her with a speed that would have impressed Judas, or Julius Caesar for that matter. One book reseller actually removed Rowling's name from the covers of her own novels, another touch Orwell would have found familiar and chilling. And this backlash, far from exhausting itself quickly, has only strengthened over time. Remember the open-world video game Hogwarts Legacy released by Warner Brothers? Although Rowling had nothing whatever to do with the development of the game, she receives royalties for it. And this, along with the fact the name Harry Potter was attached to it, was sufficient cause for activists to organize a boycott. This went as far as creating a website which would identify and publicize the name of anyone who actually purchased the game, a clear attempt at intimidation, which is a more and more common feature of trans activism nowadays. The boycott was a miserable failure. Hogwarts Legacy grossed over $1 billion and received astonishingly high reviews on Steam, 9 out of 10. But the fact it was attempted and the means by which its organizers were willing to try and carry it out, including members of the gaming media who blacklisted it, showed that Rowling's haters are not going anywhere, and the press has clearly taken the side of those haters by ensuring that any mention of her name is immediately accompanied by her anti-trans positions. Now, regardless of where one might sit on this issue, or whether one even takes a seat at all, the situation is objectively fascinating. It's fascinating because it brings a much larger political, societal issue into specific relief. The growing and increasingly bitter divide between the liberal and the progressive. Now, when one looks at what is broadly referred to as the left, it's important to understand that we're covering a great deal of political ground. The center leftist, the liberal, and the progressive are all on one side of the political spectrum, but they're hardly peas in a pod. If we start with just left of center, we find a person who in the United States votes Democratic, but might have opinions on things like national defense or social issues, such as welfare, immigration, gun control, abortion, whatever, which are more in keeping with centrist or even soft right-wing thought. They tend towards a social conservatism in practice, if not in expressed sympathy. They may be all for you to have dyed purple hair, a bone through your nose, and an invented pronoun, but they wouldn't want you in their house or their family. They're not overly political beings, and they do not obsess over politics. They believe they stand for decency and common sense, and radical ideas make them uncomfortable, even if they feel pressured to express sympathy for them. They may want to see change on specific issues, but essentially, they stand for the status quo. Liberalism is a more active form of leftism, touched in places by Marxist thought, but not actively Marxist. Liberals have strong beliefs about what they refer to as social justice. Their sympathies are with the poor, the marginalized, the downtrodden, and they are deeply, deeply discontented with the status quo and feel that society needs extensive change in order to become more equitable and just, and that many of our social, economic, and political institutions need a radical overhaul. A liberal is more likely to make their politics part of their daily identity and to choose their friendships and romantic attachments based on political alignment. However, and this is a key point, liberals, like center leftists, are generally quite comfortable in the world as it is. I don't mean that they're comfortable with it. I mean they're comfortable in it. Though their beliefs are sincerely held, the insult often levied at them that they're parlor Bolsheviks, people who cry for radical change from the ease of their middle or upper middle class lifestyles, who decry the system while directly benefiting from its supposed injustices, the limousine liberal, is not a specious criticism. George Orwell, an avowed social democrat and a devotee of Marx, was the first to point out that many on the left spend their lives complaining bitterly about things they really do not wish to change. A person who is genuinely upset about societal inequality, racism, police brutality, etc., yes, but is upset from the comfort of their suburban living room in their all-white, crime-free neighborhood. Someone who wants radical change without actually wanting the consequences of radical change to his or her own lifestyle, and without necessarily seeing the inherent irony of these positions. This would be an uncharitable and incomplete, but not necessarily wrong view of the liberal. On the other hand, the liberal is broad-minded when it comes to arguing points of doctrine with other liberals, and can do this without rancor, and indeed often with a relish for the class of sincerely held ideas. There's more than a touch of middle-class sensibility in many liberals. But a progressive, that's on the further end of the leftist spectrum in the Marxian realm. A progressive is someone who wants radical change to the system and wants to see it happen in their lifetime. And more than that, they want to help make it happen, and they want to do that sooner rather than later. A progressive has the courage of their convictions, and that they're genuinely willing to endure, or at least they believe they're willing to endure, all unpleasantness and suffering that comes with activism. They're also willing to shed middle-class, bourgeois notions of civility, politeness, and decency to see their agendas carried out. Since they regard the system, the courts and the ballot box, as rigged, they tolerate it only when it rules in their favor and tend to accept government as legitimate only when it falls on their side of the issue. Unlike liberals, who generally eschew violence if not confrontation, progressives have a somewhat violent streak in them. Violent not only in terms of rhetoric, but sometimes in terms of action. Indeed, The hyperbolic rhetoric favored by progressives, equating buying a video game like Hogwarts Legacy with genocide, for example, is a form of violence, since in effect that is what it encourages. And like all Marxists, be they avowed or in spirit, they are incredibly intolerant of disagreement within their own ranks. We'll come back to this crucial point in a moment. Now, these are my incomplete, prejudiced, and too broadly painted definitions. But they'll do for today's purposes, because it's impossible to understand the tarnishment and vandalism of J.K. Rowling and its real-life importance for the rest of us, all of us, without understanding the role in which liberals have played in their own downfall, their own descent into powerlessness and irrelevancy on the left. In a sense, and not surprisingly, it began in the halls of academia. As long as 100 years ago or more, it became evident that universities in the Western world were a breeding ground for left-wing thought. Now, this isn't a value judgment. It's just an observation. When I was in college in the 1990s, a Gallup poll revealed that 90% of American college professors identified as liberal or very liberal. Those are just facts. And in generations before this, Orwell commented on this phenomenon at great length in various essays, making his infamous crack about professors who get their crockery in Paris and their opinions from Moscow. The ideas of Marx had great currency in universities, appearing to the academic class in large part because, theoretically anyway, they stood to gain the most by a widespread acceptance of Marxian ideas. Marxism was, at its core, a movement meant to put the intelligentsia in charge of society, not workers or peasants, intellectuals. However, because communism per se never took power in any major Western state, Marxism continued to exist only as an intellectual idea, sealed off from the great masses by ivy-covered university walls. It was all theory and no practice. Modern Western liberalism was at best a severely watered-down version of it, one which existed within the traditional societal framework and still paid emotional homage to middle-class sensibilities and the status quo. However, as the decades passed, the intellectual and emotional influences of liberal professors on their students increased. The generation born into the 40s and 50s who opposed the Vietnam War and fought for civil rights as young men and women became the college professors of the 1980s and 1990s. They cut their hair and traded Nehru jackets for academic tweed, but they did not forget their ideals. Collectively, if unconsciously, they sought, at least, to open up the minds of the youth to leftist or Marxian-style thinking, and at most, to breed a generation who would finish the work they had started, and which had been so rudely interrupted by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And broadly speaking, they were successful, but in a curiously ironic way. In 2015, Professor Edward Schlosser wrote a now famous essay for Vox entitled, "I'm a liberal professor and my liberal students terrify me." He lamented that campuses had become fear-filled environments in which the goal was no longer education, but a safe environment in which students' beliefs and prejudices would be protected rather than challenged. Schlosser painted a picture of a campus in which curriculums had been redesigned to be as bland, inoffensive, and politically correct as possible, so as not to upset students with ideas or concepts which would make them uncomfortable. Schlosser summed this up in his essay by writing that the real problem is a simplistic, unworkable, and ultimately stifling conception of social justice. It's worth noting, and Professor Schlosser does not, in his essay, that this problem, like Frankenstein's monster, did not self-create. It was the inevitable end result of teaching an aggressively intolerant ideology to young and impressionable minds. To wit, that feelings matter more than facts, and that beliefs can take the place of logic, and that all right reposes in one set of ideological beliefs. The liberal professors of the 70s, 80s, and 90s created the progressive students of today as surely as Dr. Frankenstein painstakingly pieced together the abomination in his lab. They did so presumably with the best of intentions, or at least with understandable intentions, but they did so either without grasping or without caring about the dangers inherent in the project. And this too is classical Marxist thinking. As I have repeatedly said on this channel, both Lenin and Trotsky freely admitted when they took power in Russia 100 years ago that they had no idea what the end result of their social, agricultural, and economic policies would be. The whole thing was an experiment conducted with the lives of hundreds of millions of people, and if some millions happened to die in the process, well, as Lenin said, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. And it's worth noting that many of the eggs ultimately broken were loyal Marxists who simply deviated with Lenin on this or that specific issue. Now, I'm not equating progressives with Lenin and his gang, not at all. Despite what you may think, I myself harbor some progressive ideals. I do. I'm simply pointing out that they share a common ideological wellspring, as well as a common incapacity to understand the limitations of the ideology in question, its contradictions, its incompatibility with economic law, its misunderstandings of human nature, and its tendencies towards authoritarianism, extremism, and intolerance, as well as its built-in need to become more radical over time and to smash opposing lines of thought. J.K. Rowling is an avowed liberal by her own lights. She probably even identifies as progressive on some, if not many, issues. Until recently, she was the darling of many a media outlet, in part for these reasons. But she dared to deviate from the most radical of progressives on a single issue. And for this, she's been canceled. Not very successfully, but with vigor, sufficient vigor, that has her standing tarnished. And quite tellingly, not only has the left-leaning side of the press facilitated this tarnishment, many who are not radically progressive, but who still identify as left, have been reluctant or unwilling to come to her defense. The ordinary person who leans somewhere on that side of the political spectrum is leery of being seen as anti-trans, and thus stands idly by while someone they once admired and idolized gets rubbished and threatened. The climate of fear that Professor Schlosser wrote about in 2015 is hardly limited to campuses now that the monster has risen from the table and escaped the lab. It's everywhere political discourse exists. The liberals have been terrified into submission by their own creation. In the wake of the elections of 2016 and 2024, it's just as easy to argue that something very similar happened on the right wing of American politics, but that's a subject for another video, which I'm sure will be equally offensive to those on that side of the wings. Can't wait. In the meantime, I believe Rowling's present situation is important because it contains within it a foretaste of what will happen to centrist or establishment politics if those in charge of the same do not push back against this increasing militancy, this tendency to pander to a gang of destructive radicals, some of whom are only dubiously sane. Those on the left like to quip it's a big tent when they speak of the broad appeal of their political brand. This is undeniably true. This image, however, is illustrative of the problem. Tents are for circuses, and no circus should be run by its clowns. Guys, if you liked today's video, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and feel free to check out my books. They're on Amazon. The link is in the description. Until next time, stay cold and away from Lord Voldemort.